So this trend talk's called Written in Stone. And as anyone who's heard me speak before, you know that I'm really interested in why trends happen. And I really believe for creative people, if you understand why something's happening and kind of the deeper meanings behind things, you can create more original, inspired work. So I always want to start by looking at the trend and trying to figure out why I think it's happening right now and what need I think it fulfills. Okay. So we all know that we're in a time of uncertainty and change, and I'm not gonna go over all the reasons that that's so. We're living it, and we all know. And one of the things that's really interesting about a period like this is that when you're in a period of tremendous change and uncertainty, you seek and you crave simplicity, and you crave simple truths, and you crave the bedrock of reality. You really want to be able to put your feet on the ground and have a sense of knowing where things are going, which is kind of the opposite of the situation we're in right now. We're kind of barraged by social media and by news and by conflicting reports and competing views on reality. And most people are just feeling exhausted by it all. And one of the common things that we do when we're in a period of great change is we look to nature and nature's laws to be able to reorient ourselves. This is something that philosophers and educators have been noting through the centuries, that whenever a society is in a period of uncertainty and fragility and vulnerability, they'll turn back to nature to try to figure out what they believe in. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot of in interior design in particular is stone faces in interiors. I think everybody who's on Instagram or looking at magazines sees these gorgeous, luxurious apartments with exposed wall of stone, which I think is the beginning of a bigger trend. And the question here is, why is that happening? And what it makes me think back to is the idea that once something is written in stone, like the Ten Commandments, it's fundamental law about the way the world works, and it's usually given by nature itself or by something divine or greater than us. So it's this idea of getting back to the fundamental bedrock of truth. And I think it's no coincidence that when we look at, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also in Islam, that when we're looking at the prophets, the forefathers of our culture, they all went back to the desert, and they took time in the desert to meditate when they were trying to build a new way of surviving, of living ethically, of living well in community, and of moving forward and building society. And I think it's no coincidence that at a period of change, we see ourselves going back to images of deserts and having a lot of stone and having that color palette of the desert, those yellows, those oranges, those terracottas dominating the interior design market. One of the things that I find really interesting when you look at the symbolism of deserts, one of the things they talk about is if you're in an environment that is that harsh, right? And there's no vegetation, there's no water, there's not a lot of animals, it's very quiet, it automatically puts you in a meditative state. It automatically makes you slow down and start thinking about basic survival and about basic ideas. And that's one of the reasons that it's such a popular image for mystical voyages and for seeking truth and for any kind of great battles, actually, that occurred in ancient history. And it's also seen in a way as a test of a person's resilience, because it takes more than just having the right amount of water and shelter. It takes a certain will to be able to live in the desert. And when you think about the kind of inner symbolism, or the symbolism of the inner life that the desert evokes, it kind of gives a path or shows a way that we can slow ourselves down, ground ourselves, try to see as simply as possible, look inside of ourselves, and find our basic truths and our basic values, what we really believe in, what we really want to spend time doing. And that is reflected in all of the design that we see being created around us. The other thing about a desert is, other than these kinds of, it makes you extremely grateful for the little oases and the little luxuries that you have, for very basic sensual pleasures like a warm bath or a drink of water. In a way, it creates a sense of gratefulness, and it is a very humble state. And one of the other things, when you think about, and I'm just thinking again about the experience of being in the desert, is this incredible vast view. So again, if we think about what that means, it means that we're able to see into the distance, that our view is not obscured, and that we can see the sandstorms that are coming. We can see if there might be any water coming up. It's in a way an environment for people that can, animals that can walk upright, an ideal environment. It's definitely a dangerous environment, though. And part of what makes it an innately spiritual one is the fact that it is a little bit dangerous, and that it does demand that we take care of ourselves, that we be very cautious, that we be very resourceful with what we have, that we stick together in little groups. And so the very danger kind of counterbalances or almost brings out the desire to go deeper. One of the things that I think is so important about this as a design trend, apart from the fact that, at least for me, it's so beautiful, is that it's extremely material rich, and it's very much monochromatic, kind of the continuing trends from last year. And it's tone on tone, it's shades of colors, and the real differentiator comes in texture. But what's so important this year is light. And if you think about the desert, you think about searing light, extremely bright, brilliant areas, and very shadowed areas. So one of the things to look for aesthetically is this very high contrast design, where the way that you can see edges, the way that you can differentiate one thing from another, is from the light and the way it hits something, as opposed to a color change in the layout itself. All the materials, again, are raw, and the material, and obviously there's a lot of stone, and a lot of exposed stone, and a lot of rough, unhandled stone. And again, when I think about color in the desert, and for the palette that we're looking at now, what's essential to think of is you have a desert or landscape palette. It can be in the yellows and it can be in the terracottas. But what is the color of life that's in that landscape? It's still green. But it's a green that survives in a very harsh landscape. It's a green that is an accent color, not a dominant color. And so you have greens entering into this palette, but from material, like it's a very gray green, yellow green, but not a bright green. It's a green that's breaking through, that's fragile, that has an inner strength, and is like a kind of gentle or kind of ephemeral addition to the harshness of, and dryness and hardness of the desert itself. And that's a theme I want you to think about as we're going through these contrasts of a very, very harsh landscape and these kind of vulnerable, beautiful, ephemeral expressions of life throughout the landscape. And if we can think about design in the same way, that might be the balance that you'd be looking for. So one of the things I love to think about when we're looking at trends is that they never are, only in one area. And one of the biggest movements, and we know this is true in food, is going back to heritage seeds and trying to find the original complex genetic seeds, the ones that have been unmodified for various fruits and vegetables. And another one that I think is really fascinating is a resurgence in beer from Egyptian and ancient Israeli period. It's not made with yeast; it's made in another way, but it's fermented in these giant urns. And one of the things that I think again is interesting is when we look at a lot of these environments, one of the main accessories are urns and vessels, things that carry precious water. And I invite you to be aware of that as we move through. And again, we can see the same palette through the vegetables, through the fruits, through the clay, through the stone. I love this. This is actually an artist's installation. And it's kind of a commentary on the desert and on these vessels that hold the water. But also, it almost looks like an archaeological site where you find some vessels crushed, some intact. You can see these natural dyes that they're using, turmeric, I think iron for the red. And on the left, more and more, we're seeing artists put together these sort of still lifes of the basic elements of foundational, building, and, sponge, stone in their raw states, put together almost like like molecules, like building blocks for the new decor scene. And I think I find this in particular very inspiring because we can see this, we can see the palette, but we can also really see the spirit of this as a foundational building steeped in tradition kind of trend, but obviously extremely modern, really beautiful. So one of the other sides of this trend that we can see in culture right now, and I really find this fascinating, is that when we're in a really big period of uncertainty, one of the things that defines a period of uncertainty is that you can't trust that what happened in the past is going to happen in the future. So unlike our parents' generation, and to a degree our generation, we kind of knew that we would have more or less a pretty good chance of reproducing or surpassing the lives of our parents. The generation coming up now is facing all kinds of shortages and crisis and polarization, and there's absolutely no certainty that they're going to have the same opportunities and the same abundance that previous generations have grown up with. And what that means is that you look into a very uncertain future. And when that happens, the people whose voices really have power are the prophets, the people that don't come to you with a message based on scientific analysis or on data, but based on a deep personal conviction about what they think matters and what they believe in, and a sense of vision for the future. And one of the things that we're going to see more and more in our culture, and it's already happened across all kinds of traditions, are these voices, not revolutionary, but absolutely voices in the wilderness that are coming to the fore and are speaking out about the kind of community they want to build in the future. And it's the age of prophets, again, which is very much linked to going into the desert, meditating, going into the wilderness, and coming back after all this period of self-isolation with a revelation or a message for the people. So another way that we're seeing that feed interior design. And I think as we watch entertainment, we're going to see more and more stories about revolutionaries and prophets and stories that occur in the desert. So what does that all mean for people that work in interior design and the home industry? And this is really interesting. If you imagine yourself in the desert, what would be one of the things other than water that you would crave? And what you would crave would be shelter and refuge and a place of safety, a place to escape the wind, the heat, the rattlesnakes, other people, because you're basically alone. And what that means, as far as I'm concerned, for interior design is that it is the interior designers who create the home, who are creating and building a place of refuge for people. And one of the things that's interesting about a place of refuge, especially when it's based on the idea of a desert cave, is that you're protected on all three sides, from the back and the sides, so you have no sense that anything can creep up on you. But you have a wide perspective to look out on so that you can perceive any danger that's coming. So this is not like a little hut in a jungle with beautiful, big, juicy green leaves. This is a cavern or a hole in a wall where you are safe and you're with your family, and you are allowed to let your guard down and you can relax, but you also have what they call prospect, and you're able to look out on your landscape and see danger coming. And in history, one of the best examples of that is Mesa Verde, which is one of our very own ancient sites in North America, in Colorado, I believe. And it's literally, it's a village built into an opening in a cliff that can look out over the valley and scan for enemies, but still live in kind of relative peace and safety from the weather, from the elements, from potential enemies in this cave. And the homes themselves are made with the same material as the cave itself. So again, we're seeing all of those materials. It's almost a camouflage from a distance. And what distinguishes the shapes are the shadows, the way the light hits it again. And it's really a great model to keep in mind when you're thinking about this emerging design trend. Again, some of these color tones and some of the ways that it's interpreted in a more modern context, tone on tone, uneven wall, and you can see even in the way that it's lit, how important the light is. And then I just want to call your attention to the fact that there's a ball, there's a piece of wood, going back again to the fundamentals, right? Simple shapes, fundamental shapes, simple materials, tone on tone. I mean, this I really love. This is like where it becomes a little more playful, and it's still the idea of a kind of grounding or return to the primitive, but with a bit of whimsy and a bit of playfulness. And there's a trend in, furniture and design of things that look like they were made in sand or cast in clay and made by hand, the antithesis of machine made. And then I love this little figurine because for me, it really is emblematic of the kind of accessories that we're going to see coming, which is a kind of primitive play on man and animal hybrid and this sort of mythical animals, but it's the turtle, right? They carry their own shell. It's got the shape of a cave. It can hide. It just shows you where the imagination is going and the kinds of things we're probably going to be seeing more and more of. One of the things that I think is super, super important about this trend, and one of the things that I think we associate with the desert, is the whole spa tradition, is the whole idea that self-care is a way of taking care of the world. And if we can relax ourselves, if we can de-stress ourselves, if we can put ourselves in simple, spare surroundings and relax and sit in a hot tub and drink water and be quiet, then we ourselves become an oasis of calm and clarity in the culture. And so that sense of, again, of the spa aesthetic and of the desert aesthetic, leaving the spa and entering the home, is very important. And again, this idea that you can sit in the tub and be in this very safe environment and have this huge vista that you can survey in the horizon is, again, just showing you really the principle of refuge with just a little bit of prospect. And it's really important to me that the images are super inspirational, because we all know the power of beauty. But these are really images that reflect a lot of where the creative imagination is going right now, and what we're trying to do to take care of ourselves through this period. And I think after this show, you'll start to see a lot of these images in a lot of the magazines that you look at. One of the most interesting aspects of the cave is the idea that the opening doesn't have to be in front of you. Sometimes you go into a cave. And one of the most dramatic things we're seeing in architecture right now are these openings, right, in buildings where you have kind of sunlight or the sky entering from above. And actually the sides are obscured. Again, when you think about the symbolism of the desert and the ability to quiet the voice within, to meditate, to go back to the fundamentals, that image of having a big opening above your head that forces you to look upward into a land. And when you think about it, the sky is actually quite a simple, spare landscape compared to looking sideways, where you're going to see people and things and stuff like that. It forces you to sort of look back up and think about the greater issues, the greater laws. And so what we're seeing in architecture is more and more of this kind of lighting from above. In a home, of course, that's, much harder to do unless you're building from scratch and you have skylights. But it kind of points to the kind of lighting also that's coming. These sort of big, one of the things we're seeing now is these big round discs that almost mimic moon or sun shape, LED discs. And that can be a really interesting source that's coming from this trend as well. And obviously, we'll talk more about this, but we're going to talk about the human form and sort of very primitive representations of the human form, how that fits in. And what that is here is, one of the things about design is that you're designing for people and you're designing for the human body. And here, again, remember I told you to think about what is the contrast between raw, brute, hard edges, right? And the soft, ephemeral stuff of life, organic material, which in the desert is more likely to be a person than a plant. And here, the idea is that even though the house itself, the structure, accommodates the landscape, builds around the stones, creates these tiny little oases, it still needs to accommodate the soft flesh of the body. And it still it still mimics and echoes the body in these kind of biomorphic forms. Sorry. So what I invite you to look at here is the stool that's in the middle there, which I think is really typical of this trend, where you have a metal frame, a very hard, very simple, basic shape, and then you have a soft, fleshy interior. And again, it's that contradiction between something very hard and cold and something very warm and soft. Again here, this is just a slide showing you sort of some of the accessories and some of the sculpture being made and hewn, cut out of stone. But the shapes within the stone are all about curves. So even though it's in stone, they're representing or drawing out organic shapes. So on the far left, this is actually, I believe, at a museum in Los Angeles. If I'm wrong, somebody please correct me in the chat. But what's so powerful about this piece and the intention of the artist here was the juxtaposition of the monumentality of a boulder with the idea that it could be floating and light. And so again, when we look at this design, when we look at architecture, it's this juxtaposition of lightness and heaviness, of the ephemeral thing of the spirit, of the soul, of divinity, and the heaviness and the groundedness of the earth and of the laws. This is a great mirror, this little table mirror. You see again the kind of ephemeral, delicate, kind of almost technical, modern looking mirror held together by a rough stone. The refuge and the idea that it's a place of refuge can't be more important. It's still very cozy in a desert-like way. And here, again, we see that the walls are itself very hard, very rough-hewn, and that the materials and the bedding are super, super, super soft, are super inviting. And again, we see that kind of that idea, that figuration, that sort of organic figuration in the sculpture. And I think everyone has been noticing more and more those sort of in those windows, those little special little shelves made in walls, which is very, very typical of what happens in caverns. When they live in caverns, they would dig little holes that they could use as shelves. And we're seeing that more and more in design. And that's something that can really be used to beautiful effect. A niche, somebody just wrote, I just saw, or an alcove. Thank you so much. Again, one of the things that really strikes me about what's happening with design right now is that even though the structure of the home is a hard shell, and has maybe, especially these newer designs or old and ancient pieces that are being brought back, that are being refurbished, that are being brought back, is that the furniture again is soft and malleable and accommodating to the structure of the room. Obviously, it's a custom piece, but again, it's that sense that the furniture itself is adapting and shaping and moving into this more rigid structure that's protecting it. And those two things together make the refuge, the hard shell and the kind of soft, cozy interior. Here again, this is really stunning. This to me is again that kind of purity of line and simplicity that expresses the spirit of the desert, and it expresses the spirit of contemplation. It might be more of a public space than a private space, but we can see how other artists are interpreting that in lighting also. And it really, people think of the desert, and I think their immediate impression is that it looks prehistoric or it looks very primitive. It really doesn't have to. It's about the feelings we're discussing. It's about the ideas we're discussing. And then you as a creative person will bring your own taste and your own vision to that work. And if you're clean and you're more modern, then you'll do something like this. If you are, if you really enjoy texture and feeling and irregularity and asymmetry, you'll be working with more textures and more of the cave-like stuff that we saw there. But what's really important is that the spirit of the place, what it evokes and what it brings to the table is the same. What I love too is what's happening with a lot of, in art and a lot of sculpture, is a kind of whimsy, a kind of primitive whimsy and relationship between people and animals. Again, like the old times. And we can see again, here's a beautiful alcove, but we can see again that the furniture is the same color, right? It's in the same pattern. It has similar shapes, but it contrasts in materials and in forms. Again, on the left, just to take, this is vessels, more vessels, and we're going to see more and more vessels, a lot of interpretation on what vessels are, vases for flowers, vessels that hold water, vessels that are functional, vessels that are decorative. But the vessel, again, very important, and especially ceramics, which are having a renaissance right now. Some of the best artists working right now are working in ceramics, and we're seeing some of the most beautiful work come out. So there's no surprise that that's a big part of this, but also the desert is always very linked to ceramic. And again, to just go back to the idea of the cave being like a womb, and the idea of it being biomorphic, and again, just wanting to bring in some of the more modern interpretations of the cave. And these public spaces, again, where they have light coming in, or they have sort of windows that frame plain sky for contemplation, for meditation, for concentration, for relaxation. It's really, I think for a design for right now, it's quite powerful. It's quite powerful. This is great. This is an artist, and I took this image because I really wanted you to see how a lot of these forms are inspired by the physical form, by the body. You can really see that kind of abstraction, pulling out the sort of shape of the torso in these shapes, and then start to recognize those shapes more and more in design as a reflection of the body. And one of the things that strikes me again when we think about going back to fundamentals and simple truths, right? What do we know we have when everything else is lost? What do we know we have? We know we have a body, right? We know that that stays with us, and we know that we have to take care of the body. And again, that kind of simple clarity, that kind of simple foundational thinking is a part of this movement. This is, again, trying to show that one of the things about the desert is that depending on location, the desert has a very different palette. And I mean, one of the things we know is that purples, mauves are very important. They're a more and more important color as we go forward. And mauve or purples mixed with these sort of earthy colors, again, an accent like the green, and we can see the sage in here as well, is really, really sophisticated, really, really elegant. It's often associated in the desert with sunsets, but the stone itself in different environments actually has a purple cast. And so it really is one of the more interesting, subtle, and still kind of non-intuitive desert palette. Here we can see it again. A little bit more towards the browns with the hints of the green coming in. I mean, one of the things that I think is, I mean, this is again, just a very much more conventional take. We see the mixed fibers, we see the vessels, and we see a conventional house that's been decorated. It has a natural nook, and you can see how they're bringing in the feeling of the desert in a much more conventional framework. And this is probably more at the outer edge of the design world. But again, it's literally body shapes. It's literally organic body shapes made in very, very, very simple rock, stone, terracotta, very biomorphic shapes, extremely playful. And again, it's always fun to look at the more exaggerated ends of this and then see how that will be interpreted in a more conventional way. But we can see the skin color, the kind of life color in this palette coming through. And please, by the way, it's one skin color. I just realized that there's many, many skin colors like in the other photo. And I just caught myself, and I apologize for that. Here again is a much more modern take. Very clean, very classical, all the same principles. One of the things I really love about this trend is that, again, it can be very modern and it can be very rustic, but it can also be incredibly playful and whimsical. And this is one of those expressions. Really, really beautiful. Still looks like the other stuff, but the tone is lighter and more playful. See more of that? Here's again the purples and the kind of earth tones. So here's where we're going to do a bit of a U-turn. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this trend is it actually has, as much as it's about grounding ourselves in the past, it's about a projection into the future as well. Because one of the things that I think all of us have noticed in the news lately are people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk putting all of their money and all of their creative resources to trying to build here we go, to trying to build new habitats or new worlds for us on the moon and on Mars. And what is it that's so interesting about those landscapes? They are desert landscapes without water. So it's like the new desert that we are going to have to go into on our way to our new homeland. And the fascinating thing is that the palettes that those trends are following are the palettes of those planets, of the moon, the satellite, and of Mars. One of the things that we're doing here on Earth in order to prepare for living in those extreme environments is that the scientists are going to the far north, they're going to the deserts, and they're going to caves, and they're trying to figure out what it takes to survive in these very austere, arid environments so that they can figure out how we might actually live on the moon. And so we're also seeing trends of ice, which is like liquid water made into rock. And we're seeing these palettes. Again, just like in the desert, what differentiates this palette is the light and the way that the light plays through this and that the way the light hits it. But again, silent, covered, austere, very few resources, very little sound, very few animals, a kind of winter desert. What is interesting, and this is where the trend can actually veer into some of the more playful palettes of the spring, is that ice, and us Canadians know that maybe more than the Americans, ice, especially in the north, can actually hold color or reflect color. There are icebergs in Newfoundland that have aqua or kind of purple tinge to them. And that means that there is color even in these arid landscapes. And so we can have these kind of palettes, but with the same principles of tone on tone, of very soft and then very hard, just played out in this kind of Arctic landscape. And again, of course, if you're going to live in the north, just like if you're going to live in the desert, you live in a cave. You live in something that material is clearly taken right from the ground that you're living in, and it has that same shape. So very much the same trend with another skin, with another palette. But here's where we're getting into some of the more dynamic colors that we're seeing, the more sort of outer space colors that we're seeing. And this, again, is where that fantasy element about building in the deserts of the future is coming. But the future desert, unlike our desert from the past, in which we build sort of our moral laws, has these great pastels, these great colors. Again, what I really want to bring your attention to is this crystal it's not a crystal, it's actually glass in the left bottom corner. And it's the idea that we're still building a new culture and we're still working with fundamentals. And so the objects still look like rocks. They still look like basic things you would find in a landscape. But this is the new landscape. This is the future landscape. And so these materials are transparent and colorful and glossy, and they're sort of a kind of nod towards technology, but the basics of technology, the rudiments of technology. And again, we see more and more crystals, which are the sort of beautiful magical rocks that come out of caves and crystal mines. And again, like the glaciers, hold and reflect light and beautiful color and shift us away from the palette that we were looking at before towards this colder, clean, I guess, winter colors. And I mean that from anybody who's remembers how people would dress with their color palette. To me, this is the winter palette for the complexion that goes for that. But it really, these are cold colors. Again, one of the things that seems to be popping up, it's definitely, I think we just passed the anniversary of The Little Prince, and it's a perfect story for our time. It's about this lonely guy who's traveling from this lonely little prince that's traveling from planet to planet. And in this one particular planet that is completely arid, that resembles the moon, there's this one precious flower, right, that survives this arid landscape that he finds, that he takes care of, that he falls in love with. And again, you can see that there's our imagination understands that we are all about to go on the journey that the little prince went on. And those images and those mythologies are as attractive to us now as they ever have been. And again, that juxtaposition of the desert and of the cave, but in outer space or in this new mythical terrain that we're going to, is the sort of inspiration here. Another one of the places on planet Earth, besides the North Pole, that's considered extremely hostile and very hard to live in, are volcanoes. And there's a tremendous resurgence of interest in volcanic rock that a lot of people are linking to the move to try to create a community on the moon, because the volcanic rock in a lot of ways resembles moon rock. And so there's this tremendous resurgence in interest in volcanoes and in lava, and designers are inspired by the shapes and by the material. And again, this idea of imagining caves in a foreign world. So the same thing, rough, raw material, sand on the ground, but these outrageous colors. What would a cave look like in another world? And there's kind of this sense of high priests going into the cave, so there's still that element of the sacred and of the altar. And it's basically a heightened fantasy of the past projected into the future. Another example of a fantasy crystal cave. And on the far left, one of the things that you're going to see more and more of is spacemen, or people wearing spacesuits, or sort of having space helmets on Earth in mundane environments. We're going to see that a bit more, because the idea is that as the Earth is in a climate crisis and becomes less habitable, more hostile to life, that we ourselves are going to become like spacemen on our own planet. But also, it's again kind of preparing ourselves visually, psychologically, as a culture for space travel and for colonizing other planets. Salt, and this is really exciting because I love salt, maybe a little too much. But salt, again, like one of those basic elements, basic to life, is trending. And I think in spas, salt caves are more and more popular as a therapy. And here what we're seeing is artists working with salt and sort of covering objects over time with layers of salt. It's obviously a very painstaking process, and as designers, there's probably faster ways to do it. But it's this idea of taking regular objects and slowly building them up with crystal and with salt, and sort of hiding their form. And it's an allusion to the past, but there's something very futuristic about it. And again, salt to me is like halfway between the desert and sort of the future and crystallization, and sort of that hybrid material. Again, the only way you can see the shape is when light hits it and we can see the shadow. So we go from places on Earth that are not habitable, that kind of mimic the moon and mimic Mars, to actual visions of Mars and the moon. One of the things that I found out recently is that NASA is sending astronauts to live in these very, very deep caves on Earth to prepare for how we would live on the moon, because apparently they're looking at digging into caves instead of building up, which makes sense. And one of the things that I love about this trend is that it is almost exactly the same as the desert trend, but instead of being in these golds and these yellows and these terracottas, the colors of the more traditional desert, it's the color of the moon desert. So we're seeing blacks and whites and charcoals and these grays on grays. And then the other thing we're seeing are these sort of, again, juxtaposition, as you can see on the far left, between very, very, very rough, primitive stone and then extremely modern, sort of high-tech, futuristic design that comes in softly like petals, but extremely technical. You can see that it looks like it was designed on a computer, and it's that really strong juxtaposition between high-tech and low-tech, or future and past, that we sort of saw in some of the earlier designs, but is even more prevalent as we move into sort of the moon side, the moon desert. These are pieces that are just coming out. And again, we see that there's part very strong geometry and then very, very rough, destroyed sides. Again, that kind of contrast between the two. And one of the things that, as I was saying before, mimics the moon is volcanic rock. And a lot of people right now are working with volcanic rock in their design, and they're working with raiku, or a certain kind of technique in ceramic that burns and almost looks like ash. And that, again, that juxtaposition between a cup, a very controlled cup, and then an outcropping of rock, a kind of, again, mix between primitive and modern. And I think a lot of people in the design community are calling it ancestor futurism or something like this. It's like that, it's that pull between the past and the future, and the idea of the future being a period of building a new community, a new way of life, new laws in a desert, just like the one that we came from, when we first evolved as humans. Again, we see some direct product directly related to lava. Here's some more. It can be intimidating. It can be massive. I think these are pieces that you would have little pieces of in the house, but very, very dramatic, heavy, imposing, and in some ways, very comforting. No one's going to hurt you or break into your home if you've got a rock wall that thick. And again, just like with the other trends, it's tone on tone, and it's really the texture and the way the light hits it that makes all the difference. Here's an idea of what the ceramics would look like working from the materials on the moon. So instead of reflecting the earth, the colors of the earth, the yellows, the terracottas, the warm colors, it's reflecting the colors from the moon, but also very primitive forms. Another one of these trends, and this is obviously not stone, but another way that we're seeing this, and it's already been on the market, and I think was a precursor to a lot of what's coming now, is all that dark wood, and wood that's been virtually cooked until all the juice of the wood is out, and it's basically a dark coal, almost like a stone, and has matte, right? Like sandy matte, sandy black. Definitely reminiscent of this, and again, to me, of the kind of surface of the moon. And yeah, it's something that carries over very well into this trend, and it's just another material, another way to play with a material in this trend. Again, the mix of the high tech and the low, a mix of extremely beautiful straight lines, but always accommodating and being subservient to the raw material. So if you can see in the chair or in the walls in the hall, the stone doesn't submit. The stone doesn't change. It's the technology and the material that adapts to the stone. Super important in the design. And again, if you can see, like with the hallway, where they have lit the edge of the ceiling, right? The idea that where the light comes in, that the light defines the edge. And that's obviously a piece designed by Izzy Miyake. A little bit ahead of his time, as always. Some more of what we're talking about. There's some glass stone. There's a glass table. It's literally shaping itself to the stone. Shao Sung Ban, Japanese method of charring wood. Thank you. This is really interesting. This is what I was talking to you about. I only put in one slide, but there's really quite a lot of it, of the idea of the depressed astronaut, right? Of the lonely astronaut who's in a sense becoming a foreigner in their own land and is having to forge a life elsewhere. And this is the sad side. It's the sort of sad, melancholic, kind of humorous side of the trend. But as always, I always feel like artists are always ahead, and they're telling the stories before everybody else. And here they are preparing us for the trip to the moon. And now we can see that happening in design as well. One of the things I wanted to go back to here, again, when we talk about the desert landscape, and I think we get very caught up with the idea that it's very arid, but the greens that we talked about entering into the landscape as these kinds of mossy, really fragile, tenuous greens that can survive in extreme situations. I'm thinking now of the green that we see in tundra, are a very important part of this trend, and they kind of bring a coolness and a modernity. But it's this idea, if you can almost imagine a cave that has like a light film of moss growing on it, right, where there's a little bit of moisture and life clings to the water and clings to the source, and that's the way the green enters the landscape. So this is now obviously going right out into deep space. We've left Earth. We've left our satellite planet that's we've already been to and that is somewhat familiar. And we have moonstones on the Earth and a whole lot of analysis. And now we're heading to Mars, which is a much bigger, challenging trip, a much more unknown quantity. And we're seeing the fantasies and the kind of imagery get even more exaggerated as we move there. But we see a return to the desert colors because Mars is the red planet. And the truth is, there's a lot of places on Earth that look a bit like Mars. In America, in Arizona, in Utah. And so there's a kind of romance about those landscapes as we spend more and more of our creative energy thinking about Mars. This is great. This is that idea that what we build on Mars will be in these, little domes that will kind of hold an Earth's atmosphere. But what I think is so interesting, again, about that juxtaposition of high tech and low tech in the desert is that those domes have the shapes of caves, and that the green, the color of life we talked about, is contained within that human space, surrounded by a sea of sand and orange. On the left is actually a luxurious glamping hotel in Jordan that mimics what an outpost on Mars would be like. And it literally gives people the experience of having this kind of small, contained, luxurious little tent in the middle of this arid landscape. And it is one of the ways that we get to imagine ahead of time what it's going to be like for us on Mars. And it's already happening in the hospitality industry. Again, I just want to talk about some of the ways this is going to go in the future, where we're going to really push that line between the high tech and the low tech. But one of the ways we're going to keep kind of remembering that it's about the desert and it's about pioneering is that the palette doesn't change, even though we get more and more futuristic in what we're looking at. There's been a huge resurgence in the popularity of Star Wars recently. And I think that's partially because of the storyline. It begins with Luke as the hero in his own desert, living in almost what looks like a little cave or igloo. And it's all about going back to basics, fighting for the right to rebuild a community based on justice. It's on its other planets. And so there's a huge resurgence in the aesthetics of Star Wars, especially in the fashion industry. And there's another movie coming out soon called Dune, which is also a sci-fi that takes place on a desert planet. And again, we're going to see a lot of influence from the way the design, from the set design from that film and from the fashion of that film. And here again, we're seeing that combination of earth tones and purples. And this is, I mean, again, when we're looking at the sort of more extreme sides, the more extreme expression of this trend, maybe the younger expression of the trend, we can see that the purples and the blues represent the high tech, and the browns and the neutrals represent the low tech. And the browns and the neutrals are always heavy, the heavy materials, the more significant materials, and then the kind of lighter materials are in the purples, are in the metallics. This is, I mean, this to me, this image is one of the most interesting ones because it's from a fashion shoot. It's emblematic to me of one of the more interesting expressions of this trend, which is the idea that you're still working with you're working in very, very severe conditions, right? So let's say you're on Mars and you don't have a factory and you don't have a big group of people and you don't have you don't have the ability to necessarily construct things. You're going to be making the fantasy is that you're making very primitive forms in the same way that we did in the desert thousands of years ago, but we're using new materials. So again, it's this juxtaposition of these amorphic kind of childlike shapes, but in shiny metallics. So this is, I think, the end of the talk, and it's a little bit the sort of utopian image of the new explorer in the new desert, and the way that architecture is going to accommodate the desert and try to create refuge and help us build a new society. And that's, I mean, a very powerful mythology for our time. So thank you very much. And as always, anyone that wants to have this and have the Pantones and sort of the inspiration can reach out to Renwil. They'll let you know how to contact me and how to get a copy of this. And you can follow me on Instagram. And I hope that we have time for questions and a bit of discussion. And I'll go back to Jen.